Why, if you look what's happening in the States now, a lot of the, what would you call them, tech bros, rode in behind Donald Trump. People wouldn't have assumed that a few years ago because he promised this big deregulatory agenda. And we've got that here? No, we haven't. There was that thing, was it Christmas Eve, when Starmer and Reeves said, oh, actually, this economic growth thing sounds like a good idea.
You mentioned some of the sort of problems that she's been having, some mysteries over her CV, some funny expenses perhaps in a previous job, but actually really what's properly putting her in trouble is this, it's the state of the economy.
Universities, 45 million quid on these in salaries in the last few years, and taxpayers' money has been going on, what was it in there, TikTok dances and queer robots and all this sort of just complete rot.
We good? Hello, I'm Alys Denby, Opinion and Features Editor of City AM, and this is What's the Context, where we'll be talking through the week's best writing on business, markets, innovation and freedom, all of which can, of course, be found online and in the pages of City AM. With me to take us through is James Price, a former government special advisor, senior fellow at the Adam Smith Institute, and most importantly, a City AM columnist. And today we're going to be discussing Rachel Reeves' jobs tax, whether rumours of the death of DEI are to be believed, and how pub closures are also affecting the music industry. So James, thanks so much for joining me. So first thing I want to talk about is the ongoing effects of Rachel Reeves' budget. Matthew Kilcoyne, who's an economist, wrote for us this week, we're now seeing the effects of this in the job market and that it's proving the Laffer curve. Can you explain to us what he means by that?
Basically just says a very simple truth, which is that if you, for example, have no taxes at all, obviously the state will bring in no money. But of course, if you tax everybody 100%, the state's not going to really make any money because people are going to stop working, no one's going to bother to do anything. So at some point there is an optimal tax take. You can imagine on the graph, it kind of goes up in a bell curve and goes down again. And Laffer never went any further than saying exactly where that would be. But that lets you into a world that says, well, if I raise taxes, you would assume that I would bring in some more money. But actually, if there are other factors there and people go, well, now that tax rate is higher than it is in the UK and France or in Germany or America, I might stop that kind of economic activity. It's not worth my time. And so this idea that if you do some sort of dynamic pricing of taxes, we'll have a better understanding of the effect of those taxes over time. It's a very simple idea, and if Rachel Reeves really were the famed economist that her CV used to say that she was, she might know this.
Yeah, so I mean, what he says proves that this is happening is some data that's out this week from the CIPD, which says that about a third of British firms are planning to cut jobs and about half are freezing prices. So we are now seeing the real-time effects of how this tax rise is essentially eroding the economic activity it's seeking to tax.
Yeah, absolutely right. And look, this is something that we all were talking about at the time. And I'm afraid to say that a lot of people in the city were fooled, perhaps, maybe willfully fooled, seeing that the writing was on the wall and the country was going to vote Labour in, I would say, as a very partisan figure, on default, because my old party, the Conservatives, lost rather than Labour winning. But there was this idea of, what was it called, the smoked salmon offensive, of Labour figures going around hobnobbing in the city and saying, don't worry, we're listening to you guys, just like Tony Blair's Labour Party, we're really pro-business. What was the Mandelson line? We're intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. And people in the city went, okay, bit of motivated reasoning here. I can choose to believe this. Everything's going to be fine. And now the rubber's hit the road and reality hits. Turns out if you tax people into oblivion, you get a massive dampening of economic activity. We're all the poorer for that.
Absolutely. And I think what's particularly troubling is where you look what sectors are being hit hardest. So actually the city, people who are reading City M are probably going to be fine. Big businesses can absorb these costs. It's businesses like hospitality, like childcare, small businesses that employ lots of people on quite low wages that are being hit the hardest.
Yeah, and it's deeply upsetting, this, isn't it? That those people are the lifeblood of the economy, right? Millions and millions of people who are just trying to earn a crust, for whom the idea of profit being a dirty word. They say, no, profit is how I end up, going on my one holiday a year. It's how I put new films for my kids to go and see at the cinema. It's those little treats left over after working hard. And these are the people that are suffering these kinds of policies. You make a great point that these big businesses can absorb it. And unfortunately, big business does have a tendency to do that. Look at compliance right across the board. Once new regulations come in, big businesses may fight against it. But when it happens, they've got the legal teams, they've got the accountancy guys, they've got all those people that they can gatekeep around that and stop new entrants to the market. And it's those kinds of new disruptive entrants that will help the kind of economic growth we really, really need. That's why if you look what's happening in the States now, a lot of the, what would you call them, tech bros rode in behind Donald Trump. People wouldn't have assumed that a few years ago because he promised this big deregulatory agenda. And we've got that here? No, we haven't. There was that thing, was it Christmas Eve, when Starmer and Reeves said, oh, actually, this economic growth thing sounds like a good idea. Who shall we ask? Should it be the think tank? Should it be businesses? Should it be enterprise? No. Let's ask the regulators how they can go for growth.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Though she has this week, I think, called in a bunch of banks and so on to sort of, basically begging them for ideas for growth. And they say, well, you shouldn't have done the non-dom thing. Essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, what do we think about Reeves's prospects at the moment? You mentioned some of the sort of problems that she's been having, some mysteries over her CV, some funny expenses perhaps in a previous job. But actually, really, what's properly putting her in trouble is this. It's the state of the economy, right? And there's rumours that Keir Starmer's going to overrule her to try and increase defence spending. Where's she going to get that money from? There's possibly a fiscal event coming up in the spring. We're going to get some new OBO forecasts, possibly a spending review, possibly something more like a minor fiscal event. Do you think she's going to survive this? What do you think she's going to do?
Do you know what? Paradoxically, although it would be really embarrassing for the Labour government to lose a chancellor like this, and that the budget that Reeves was in charge of and delivered in, October, after several months, should have been very good. That was very bad. I actually weirdly, perversely think that she's the best that Labour have got.
Gosh, really?
Right. Well, if you think about anybody else around that cabinet table, I'm not sure there's a single one of them with any actual private sector experience at all. And Reeves may have, let's just call a spade. She lied about her levels of experience. She said that she worked at the Bank of England, for a decade? It was 5 years.
She said she worked as an economist when in fact she was a complaints handler, I think.
Right. And I think what actually happened is that she saw there was a plum Labour seat coming up in Leeds. So she moved from London up to Leeds to ingratiate herself with the local Labour Party, the local community. I've got no real problem with somebody doing that. It's the kind of sacrifice that you want people to make to serve in public office. But when she's fibbed about all these things, it's put her in big trouble. But as I say, she's the only one who's got any experience there at all. We've seen the business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, this week as well, who said that he was a solicitor. Turns out, nope, no, he wasn't. I mean, some even would say that's breaking the law. It's breaking the law to impersonate being a solicitor for the purposes of practicing law. And there's some controversy over whether Reynolds may, by saying this, perhaps saying he was a full solicitor to get elected even, that there may be some problems there too. So those are the two most pro-business, growth-minded people around that cabinet table. If they go, goodness me, are we going to get someone who's more pro-business than them? I'm not sure there is anybody in that party with it, which really, really scares me.
OK, so a vote of confidence in the Chancellor there. Let's move on. Let's talk about your column that you wrote this week. You wrote about the rumours of the death of DEI. Have they been greatly exaggerated? Take us through it.
Well, as a moderate writer as ever, picking the non-controversial topics. So DEI, for the few people who haven't spotted this is diversity, equity and inclusion, this sort of, I would call so far as to call it a fad or a trend that's kind of swept through. Started in the United States of America, like so many of these things do, and it's swept over here. And just as the tide of DEI has been receding over in the States with the vibe shift that I've talked about in this piece, it's a great phrase, the vibe shift, it will happen here as well in all kinds of ways that big businesses are starting to shed their DEI teams, not just in the States, the kind of Walmarts that you would assume, but again, these big tech giants who pushed so much of this kind of radical progressivism, the Metas, the Amazons, the Googles, they're shedding all of this stuff. The big banks, the Goldmans, the JP Morgan, the Citigroups, they're shedding a lot of their net zero practices, which I think would come under the kind of larger cultural war that you think that we need to impoverish ourselves in the UK in order to make these targets that aren't actually going to make any real dent in improving the environment, I would go so far as to say. The point of the piece, though, is that a lot of these guys have dined so well. I think I go so far as to call them grifters. They've dined very well. And termites, yeah, again, very moderate, inclusive language from me, passing all my DEI tests. But these people have dined so well on the taxpayer teat in so many ways, and that so many of our institutions are still, what was Robert Jenrick call it, spaffing money against these things. Universities, 45 million quid on these in salaries in the last few years. And taxpayers' money has been going on, what was it in there, TikTok dances and queer robots and all this sort of just complete rot. The sort of stuff that Doge in America is finding, we're finding here. We've got to stop all of this.
And I think what I found really interesting in your piece is this idea that it's, fine, businesses are quite responsive to what's going on in government because that's the market.
Right.
But the institutions, this stuff is so embedded, and I think I see it so much when I go to art galleries, for instance. I remember going to the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool last year, and everywhere you look, there are sort of posters hectoring you that the money for this collection came from slavery, and that you shouldn't be just enjoying these beautiful paintings and sculptures, the richness of this great city. You should be feeling ashamed. And one thing that particularly struck me, there's this beautiful, sorry, this is a bit of a personal rant, but there's this beautiful funerary monument, beautiful marble sculpture of two little girls who died of tuberculosis when they were children. A stunning piece of sculpture. And there's the label on it says, slaves didn't get funerals. This was a wealthy family who could afford to pay for this funeral. It's like, so you're not even allowed to just think it's sad and beautiful that these children died. And that, I think, is where you see the rot of DEI and the kind of its worst expression, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think your first point is great, that businesses can do this stuff quite quickly. They can just shed all this stuff. It's not only is it a dead weight for them, I think actually it's really actively negatively harmful to workplaces. You get this, I think the Harvard Business Review has talked about this in other areas, that if you've got an employee who is a member of an ethnic minority, there are middle managers who are so scared about causing offence or tripping any of these things that rather than have a quiet word about performance, the way they might do with, say, another white colleague, that they go, oh God, I don't want to make a problem here. So they immediately escalate it to the kind of formal disciplinary channels. And then that makes everything much worse because this plus scum are being targeted. I don't see other people being targeted. And so it causes all these different kind of stresses and strains amongst races, amongst religions, amongst sexes, all these sorts of things. And let's not forget that one of the few very good people who work in what we would now maybe call DEI, Martin Luther King, said we should judge people on the content of their character rather than these things. So that kind of paucity of thinking that's really actively negatively affecting it, I think you're dead right. And I think you're also right that this institutional point is so problematic. Universities, galleries, all these guys that get huge amounts of taxpayer funding, don't worry about the bottom line. No. They'll keep this going. What Rob Henderson might call a luxury belief. They can keep going for this stuff because they're not having to pay for it. And as you say, I just think it's corrosive. You can't mourn the death of two little girls from tuberculosis, right? Those people, of course, are a stand-in. They're a synecdoche for all those who died of tuberculosis at a tragically young age, and how wonderful it is there are now cures for those kinds of things. The idea of having basic human empathy to understand how other people who don't look like you or live where you live can feel is all being eroded because of this stuff.
And it's not a trade-off. You can mourn those little girls and all of those people who died anonymously from slavery in terrible circumstances.
Yeah.
If I would minorly stick up for DEI, I think that there must be some places where it's useful and necessary. The one thing I think about is how, for example, if you're a black woman in the UK, you're 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And that's not explained by socioeconomic circumstance alone. That just has to be racism. So I feel like there must be some organisations and institutions where it is useful to look at these things through a DEI lens. Do you think there is any other examples that you might?
I'm absolutely all for the healthcare providers or anybody else looking what the data actually tell them and acting on it. The problem is that so much of this stuff so quickly has become so scientific, so unscientific, that you can't really tell these things. And of course, the last thing in the piece is that whilst we're wondering about how many genders there are, you've got Russia and Ukraine and the Americans perhaps pulling out. You've got the threat of China. You've got actual environmental issues that we're not coming up with new technologies to be able to solve. And if our universities are fannying around with all this sort of, what do I call it, woke tosh, right, then they're not focusing on the really existential problems.
Yeah. So the last story I wanted to talk about was an article we had in our pages by Mick Foster, who's the CEO of something called GigPig, and he's talking about the poor state of the hospitality industry, but actually this has wider halo effects on other industries as well. So the music industry is saying lots of bands like Oasis, like bands that we're going to be celebrating quite soon at the upcoming Brit Awards, had their start in pubs, greasy floors. We're going to lose out on many of the next generation of our creatives. What do we think about that?
Yeah, well, again, this is the tragic thing about bad governance, right? You see again the headline thing. Okay, we're going to put this tax up on this. We're going to do this, that, and the other, and it's all going to be great for people. Well, you don't look at the negative effects there, right? Just take, for example, the taxes on beer, right? I think taxes on beer go up. It's called what's known as a Pigouvian tax. So you put a tax up on something in order to disincentivize people doing it. That's why you put extra taxes on smoking, for example, right? Of course, no one ever pressed to wonder what happens when you put extra taxes on income. We know what happens there, but that's beside the point. You tax beer more, fewer people can afford to go to the pub for as long, beer, the pub industry suffers, fewer people start going out. As you say, knockover effects, taxis suffer, musicians suffer, all these negative effects. And that's because the cost of doing these things is so high. That's one part of it. I think another part of it is just licensing laws. Right? London has had, what was her name? Amy LaMay. Who was supposed to be, exactly, by name, by nature, right? Yeah. A great case of nominative determinism. Paid an eye-watering salary to do about 5 minutes work a week in order to boost London's nightlife. And of course, under her tutelage, under her watchful eye, more live venues and more places for nightclubs and all the rest of it have shut. It's not happening in Manchester, by the way. A guy called Sacha Lord there doing the same job. Manchester nightlife thriving. Here in the capital, it's suffering enormously. And what does that do to people? It just means your quality of life is much worse, right? You're so taxed here. Sadiq's done nothing about the kind of knife crime epidemic and your phone being snatched. It's miserable all the time. And when you want to just go and escape, you want to go down to the pub with your mates, you want to let your hair down and go and boogie like I used to do a million years ago, you can't do it because it's too expensive and places are shutting down. And the last thing about it is that you've got people who will move into somewhere like Soho, for hundreds of years has been this fun, hip, happening place or whatever, will move in there, move opposite a pub, and then start complaining about it. No, just move to Surrey, move to somewhere quiet, right? And let Soho be Soho. Let these places, let the inner bits of cities have fun and not be subject to these kinds of ridiculous NIMBYist licensing laws.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the fate of our pubs is such a sort of, synecdoche is the word you used earlier, for the state of the economy more broadly, because it's a result of the housing crisis, it's a result of the change in working habits since the pandemic. Licensing laws, as you say, and NIMBY culture is all society's problems all in one, affecting pubs, which are the place where we're meant to go to have fun.
Right.
How much is a pint in the city these days, do you know?
Well, I mean, I've paid upwards of £7-8 for pints before.
Yeah,
and at that point, you're lucky that you've got the pint in which you can cry, right? It's that depressing. The government can change it, can change its rules. Think about that Laffer curve we talked about at the top, and we can make things better, and we can all go to the pub and celebrate.
Well, I think with that, James, we're going to go and have a pint.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you very much.